Hello, my name is Darcy O'Hara, and I'm the director here at the St. Vincent de Paul Young Adult Center. Anyone who's been through the center will tell you about one big experience we have here is our walking tour of our neighborhood of Germantown. We thought that in these unprecedented times, a way to connect you all with the history and the lessons that we get from our neighborhood of Germantown is by recording this walking tour and bringing it to you all. Just a little bit of context about our city as a whole before we dive specifically into our neighborhood of Germantown. Philadelphia, among the top 10 biggest cities in the United States, so New York, Chicago, LA, Philadelphia ranks as the most impoverished, so number one in poverty. It also ranks among the top 10 of most segregated. I think we're like 6 or 7. So Philadelphia is a wonderful city with a really complicated past, just like Germantown. So we like to say that this walking tour is kind of a practice in truly seeing. Anyone who's been on a walking tour, I think, can attest to the fact that walking tours really give you a chance to see that the land around you, wherever you are, is drenched in story and drenched in history, and so much more history and stories than we're even used to hearing. So this walking tour will be really inviting you to slow down and pay attention to those stories, even if they're different from what you are used to hearing. So we'll be encouraging you to pay attention to all the wonderful things that Germantown has to offer while not shying away from the more complicated past. You don't become such a segregated and impoverished city and neighborhood without that complicated past. So again, just inviting you to slow down and pay attention and come along with us. The first thing we want to acknowledge as we begin this walking tour is the indigenous people who originally lived here. So this land, this big part of land that we are on, was originally inhabited by the Lenape people. They owned this land up until the time period when the German Quakers came and settled this area. So as you see here, we're actually on the land of Germantown Friends School, just a testament to the way that German Quakers have really stayed in this area and continue to shape the history and present of Germantown. An interesting part of the history here is when the German Quakers came over, William Penn really initially established this land to follow the idea of the peaceable kingdom. His ideal vision was because he had experienced religious persecution in his home country, he really wanted to come here and live justly and peacefully with his brothers and sisters from all different backgrounds. William Penn really accomplished this for the most part in his dealings with the Lenape when he first came to this area. He negotiated in good faith with a lot of their leaders. However, 50 years later, when William Penn's sons took over, John and Tom Penn, they did not negotiate in good faith. There's this story called The Walking Purchase, where kind of out of nowhere, people don't know if it was forged or if it was just like randomly found, or but basically the Penn sons came up with this document that said that there was negotiation between the Lenape leaders and William Penn that said everything west of the Delaware River, a day and a walk half west of the Delaware River, belonged to the German settlement. The Lenape kind of went back and forth with this, saying we never signed this. We've never heard of this, but eventually they signed this document. Then the Penn brothers hired 3 of their best runners in the colony and had those men run as fast as they could for a day and a half. So originally, in the Lenape's mind, they thought they were going to be giving, I think, something like 40 miles. They ended up giving about 70 miles up to Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, if anyone's familiar with the area. I just think that's an interesting story because it kind of cuts this juxtaposition of ideals versus reality. And though the German Quakers came and settled with this idealized idea of living with their neighbor, the way that if that's not followed through with, how that can really fall apart. On the other side of that, the German Quakers have a really, really rich history of pacifism, social justice, and advocacy. One that has really shaped present day and past Germantown. The Quakers have this commitment to live lives that outwardly express their inner experience of God. They're also known for their integrity and their simplicity. So we're actually in what I think is one of the coolest parts of Germantown. Right here in 1688, the first ever protest against slavery took place in the United States. It was by a group of German Quakers who felt so inspired by their faith that they decided to write a protest against slavery. Considering that any abolition law wasn't even talked about or written for another 92 years, it's a really, really big testament to the way that these German Quakers were not limited by their time. A big reason that the German Quakers, like we kind of said, have such a history, or just the Quakers in general, have such a history of activism and social justice and kind of being a little ahead of the game. Some people kind of say that it's because the Quakers are very intentionally like an equal organization where everybody's voice are valued equally. So if you've ever been to a Quaker meeting, what you'll often see is you go in and it starts and everyone just sits in silence. And the idea is you listen to your heart, and if you feel like God is calling you to stand up and say something, then you stand up and do so. It could be your first day ever going. You could be 8 years old. You could be 92 years old. And the idea is everyone's voice is valuable. And because of that history of the way that they lead their reflections, it really creates a space where all kind of voices are heard and listened to, even our more marginalized voices. Another nickname for Germantown is Freedom's Backyard. That's because along Germantown Avenue, which we've been traveling up and down pretty much this whole walking tour, along Germantown Avenue there are 16 different historical sites. There are homes of people, there are places where battles were held, there are schools that are really historically significant. And right behind me is one of those homes that's super historically significant. So the Johnson family lived here for 3 generations. It was built by the Johnson family, and they were also Quakers who were inspired by their faith to kind of be not limited by their time period, right? So during this time period where there was a lot of slavery, it maybe wasn't, at the time it actually wasn't legal. We didn't have slavery up here in Philadelphia, but often what would happen is if your slave escaped and came up through the north, then that enslaved person, like, it was against the law for Northerners to help that enslaved person. So the Johnson family not only were abolitionists, but they also helped house, they were a stop along the Underground Railroad. So that's one part of the history. Something I think is really interesting is at the same time period, another family of note lived in the area, and they were the Chew family. Philadelphia has a giant street called the Chew Street. There's a giant piece of land where the Chew family lived, and the Chew family are the largest and longest holders of slaves in Philadelphia. So like I said, even though slavery was illegal here in Philadelphia, the way that they got around it was they found a loophole, and the loophole was called the 6-month residency law. So the idea behind this was if you brought a person who you had enslaved up to Pennsylvania to work for you or into a northern state, that person, if they were there for longer than 6 months, would, on like the first day of the 6th month, they became free. So the way the Chew family got around this was they had plantations in Maryland and Virginia as well. So they would bring people up to work for them here for 5 months, and then to avoid that like law, they would switch them out with other people from their other plantations. So none of their slaves were up here and could benefit from that 6-month policy. So again, what I think is interesting is this idea of the Johnson family kind of being prophets of their time. So the prophets we see in the Bible are people that are not limited by their time, and they're really the voice of God on earth, reminding the people around them how they're falling short of how God has called them to live. So what I love about the Johnsons is they weren't limited by their time. They weren't people that could just say, that's just how it was back then. They listened to this inner voice, inner experience of God, and they realized that slavery did not have a place in the world, the kingdom of God on earth that they wanted to build. I know a stereotype about Philadelphians is they kind of have a chip on their shoulder, but I feel like this is a good reason to have a chip. You guys forget that Philadelphia was the capital of the country at some point. I'm just saying. So what's interesting about this space here is this was where George Washington ran the country during the 1793 yellow fever pandemic. So at the time, he was in Philadelphia, but Philadelphia is cramped. There's not a lot of open air. So he decided to move himself and his cabinet up to the rural village of Germantown and run the country from here. So this is what we like to call the Germantown White House for that reason. Germantown eventually developed into kind of a vacation spot for wealthy Philadelphians. That's because at the time period people didn't have like cars, so even the small trip out here, just a couple miles out of Center City, was really like a big trip out into the country. Germantown is kind of high, like elevation, so it's a little bit cooler out here, a lot more spacious than like the Center City at the time period. This is kind of little remaining piece when Germantown was its own little town borough. So this was built right before they were invited to be incorporated into the city of Philadelphia. There was a lot of resistance to that because neighbors here viewed Philadelphia, viewed Germantown as like a little more ritzy of a place. They didn't want to be forced to incorporate to Philadelphia. But they eventually did, and so now this town hall is kind of abandoned, and we're still trying to figure out what to do with it. During the early 1900s, as this part of the city became part of the city, this area was settled by a lot of Germans, Irish, and Scottish people. Actually, my grandparents, one side of my grandparents were settled here. And so there's this time period in the early 1900s where Germantown is kind of flourishing. It's very much a white working class area. And then, so we can kind of see the way that Germantown changes in the 1900s, illustrated in the public high school here. If you look on your left, this building was the original building built in 1914. And then this section was added on a bit later, I think in the 40s or 50s. At the peak of this high school, there were over 3,000 students who attended this public high school. It was students from all sorts of different economic backgrounds, but primarily white. So in 2013, so at the peak, this high school held 3,000 people. In 2013, when it eventually was closed, there were only 676 students, and 10% of those students were either in foster care or homeless. So there's this really big gap between what this place was and then what it has become in the present day. And the question we ask now is what happened? How did this happen? The school flourished from 1914 until about the 1960s. During that time period, across the country this happened in cities. A lot of the white people living in the cities moved out to the suburbs, We call this, you've probably heard this called before, the white flight. My grandparents participated in it. It was when, so at the time period, the second wave of Great Migration of Black and African American families from the South moving north for opportunities moved to these cities along the East Coast. And as neighborhoods started to diversify, these white families kind of panicked and moved to the suburbs, right? So for many years, that's kind of what we thought happened to our cities. It was just kind of a decision made by like families one by one, motivated by racist fear, and also just this idea of self-segregation. Like they had the choice of like, I want to be with people who look like me, people who pray like me, and people, you know, like that. But the reality is, when we look into our history, we realize that the segregation of our city in Philadelphia, and probably a lot of cities, comes down to two main things: blockbusting and redlining. Redlining is discriminatory practice by which banks, insurance companies refuse or limit loans, mortgages, and insurance within specific geographical areas, mostly determined by race. So, after the Great Depression, as part of the New Deal, a number of programs were introduced to bolster parts of the economy and to support the deserving poor. Part of this New Deal, one of the policies, you might have remembered this word, were redlining. So redlining basically took areas, drew lines around areas determined to be good investments and lines around areas that were determined to be bad investments. What's interesting about the way that they did this back then, so right after the Great Depression, is they did it based on race. So right here I have a map of Philadelphia, and this was the map that was put together then. And if you see, well, not here, but basically the red areas would be places that they considered bad investments. And then the white areas, green and blue, would be considered good investments. So basically, as they were drawing these maps, at the top would be white people, and at the time white people were like broken down into like more desirable white people, less desirable white people. At the bottom were Black and African Americans, as well as Mexican and indigenous people. So those areas where Black and African Americans and indigenous and Mexican people lived would be considered bad investments. So then if a person of color is then going to the bank to ask for a loan to start a small business or a mortgage, the bank would look at the area they lived and be like, that is a bad area to invest. That's why we see, even here in Philadelphia, for many years, I lived in Fairmount, which is a section of Philadelphia that's been largely white for a while, and they've pulled up all these trolley tracks and repaved over them. But here you'll see the trolley tracks. A trolley has not run here for years, but the trolley tracks still stay because the city kind of deemed it was not worth investing in this area. Still, even redlining still happens today. There was an investigation that happened, I think like within the last 5 years, that found that TD Bank is proven to have the most cases of discriminatory lending practices based on race. So the way they did this investigation is they sent 2 people in with identical like income, identical credit score, all of that, and they found that the white person was much more likely to get the loan than the person of color was. So I bring that up because these things are still happening today. They might look different, they might look a little sneakier or less identifiable, but they are still happening today. Also, we might look at this map and we might hear me talking about redlining that happened 100 years ago, and we might ask, why does this matter? And the reality is, if we took this map and laid it over present-day Philadelphia, we would see that the places that were deemed worth investing in 100 years ago are the places that are really safe neighborhoods right now, right? With good infrastructure, good schools, and same for the neighborhoods that 100 years ago we decided were not worth investing in. Those are suffering a little more today. We talked about how Philadelphia became so segregated. Now I want to talk about some of the reasons it became so impoverished. One big reason for this is the process of deindustrialization. So for many years, people were able to support their families by working in factories. For example, my grandfather was able to support his wife and his 5 kids through college on his Honeywell factory job. So he got benefits through that job, and that was his job for 50 years. A lot of the jobs after the manufacturing jobs kind of went abroad, where labor was cheaper. The jobs that replaced those were not really sustainable jobs. So you have on one end like big box stores like Sam's Club or BJ's. You also have like restaurant work, which doesn't have benefits and has less reliable hours. So after those factory jobs left, the jobs that largely came in, especially for Philadelphia starting in the late 80s, early 90s, the government started this process of wanting to attract more companies into the city so that there would be kind of to increase our wealth. The problem is the jobs they attracted were largely jobs that required secondary education. So we have a lot of the jobs here in Philadelphia are like in healthcare as well as in higher ed. So that attracts, like, those are jobs for people who have a college degree. In Philadelphia, only about 65% of our city has a high school degree. So there's this large group of people who do not have the degrees for the jobs available. So now we talked about the deindustrialization of Philadelphia and how that pulled jobs from the city, as well as the forced segregation of Philadelphia. I want to talk a little bit about this time period that we call urban plight. It was this time period where cities were underfunded, and because they were underfunded, really overrun by some crime as well as graffiti. So, like many things, we try to arrest our way out of this problem. You see, if you ever heard of the war on drugs, that's when this kind of starts ramping up. So this is when we start this time period of mass incarceration. So one way we tried to get rid of our graffiti problem was by arresting the culprits, but we quickly realized that wasn't working. So something that came out of this time period is called the Mural Arts program. The city of Philadelphia is the city with the most murals in the entire United States, and it's only second in the world to Mexico City. So behind Mexico City, Philadelphia has the most murals. What's cool about the Mural Arts program is I think it's a real testament to what can get done when we are creative in love, instead of committing ourselves to the same solution of incarcerating our way out of a problem when it's no longer working. So the Mural Arts program sought to kind of encourage these young graffiti artists to join their program. Then they would be funded both privately as well as through the city government to make these murals in different neighborhoods throughout the city. So each mural specifically will focus on something about the neighborhood. So here in Germantown, we have a really large Muslim population, many beautiful mosques. We also have down here, you'll see they're doing some sign language, and that's because the Philadelphia School for the Deaf is in Germantown. So what's cool about the Mural Art program is that they still go on today, and they provide jobs for people with disabilities, for people coming out of incarceration. People who are involved with the Mural Arts program have a significant less likelihood of going back to jail. And yeah, it just helps provide solutions for an issue that we couldn't arrest our way out of. So something I think is really interesting is part of this process of urban renewal, of attracting jobs back to the city, were these highways. This happened in cities all across the United States. So these highways, a lot of these highways are built for the point of getting wealthy suburban people like to cut through the city and go directly to the wealthy center. So they are built largely through and over these poorer areas to help kind of wealthy suburbanites go directly to city center. Philadelphia is not the poorest because we have the most poor people. We are the poorest because we have not gentrified yet. So a lot of these other big cities, LA, Chicago, New York, they've been gentrifying for years. They've been having outsiders who are wealthier move into their neighborhoods and displace long-term residents. So basically what has happened is many people who have lived there for years can no longer afford to live there. Philadelphia is among the last big cities to gentrify, but right now we are gentrifying rapidly. We are gentrifying at 19 times the rate we were in the 1990s. So I've worked in Germantown now for just 5.5 years, but even since I've started working here, there's been really big changes to our neighborhood. We're seeing an increase in like these trendy stores that pop up, right? So there's nothing inherently wrong with trying to change your neighborhood and attract different kinds of people to it. The problem is when we want to change neighborhoods and address the need, like instead of addressing the needs of the community. So I'm hopeful for Philadelphia. I think we have it in us to be able to kind of move forward and create opportunities for one another. And not forget our community as our community members as we change. But we'll see. So as we finish up our walking tour, I hope you did have this experience of truly seeing, and I invite you to do this in your own community. Kind of remind yourself that, like we said in the beginning, our land, every sort of land, is cloaked in stories and in history. We just need to do sometimes a little bit of extra work of digging to see the deeper history there. Additionally, something else I hope you recognize from this trip, this walk, is that things aren't just the way they are for no reason. Our present is shaped by intentional decisions made by individuals and policymakers in the past. I hope this empowers you not only to do some research on some of the policies that shaped your community, but also helps you recognize that the decisions and policies that we are making now will have ramifications for years to come.